in the last 2 months, you've had an acceleration of territory gained by the Russians. According to Julian Rupka, it could be as much by the end of this month, depending on how things go, close to 900 to possibly 1,000 square kilometers this month alone, which would set an all-time record. So
I agree.
Speed.
But remember, again, you define success when you compare the result to the stated objectives. And what was the objective? Was demilitarization. Demilitarization refers to a potential, not to territory. Meaning that, and that's very much Clausewitzian, and the book on the Russian art of war is explicit on that the Russian military doctrine is based on the destruction of a potential. As Clausewitz said, you have to destroy the potential, the military potential. It's not territory that is the key aspect. Therefore, if you compare now the 1% that has been gained, and probably, as you rightly said, you have an acceleration so far. But again, this is not the main point. The main point is that the Russians managed to destroy, in fact, they have destroyed twice or probably 3 times the initial Ukrainian army. So but of course, since nobody talks about Ukrainian casualties or even fatalities, then of course nobody can verify this. Me neither, by the way. I'm just based on this the figures provided by War Tears, and they may be wrong. But again, this is just to highlight the difference between this 1% of territory that is used in the Western narrative and the number of casualties and fatalities. In fact, when I talk about 600 people, I'm talking about fatalities for Ukraine. Fatalities, not casualties. Meaning that
desertions, for that matter, which by this year alone are 161,000 according to Ukrainian sources. It's now then you're getting to the point to where you're getting both. Because if you do destroy, and just for those who may not know, the logic behind the Russian strategic objectives is if you destroy the capacity, you're going to get the territory in one big blow. You don't have to take it piece by piece. And they're doing it in the air, they're doing it with the infrastructure, and they're doing it with the personnel. And I mean, and the economy for that matter. So it's a really across the board, and it's really starting to have an effect. Now, that brings us back into this potential for a peace plan, because there are those who recognize everything you just said, and they're looking on the ground and thinking this can't end well. And we are Kaya Kallas aside, or the Zelensky aside, who may want to keep going, they won't be able to because the numbers are what they are. Now, I wish I could just keep the bony finger pointed at the Europeans and at the Ukrainians. Unfortunately, there are those right here in Washington, D.C. on Fox News who seem to be pushing the same bad narrative.
You'll have to excuse me, John, for not being optimistic at all, and I base that on the decades I spent at CIA trying to see the world through the twisted KGB eyes of Vladimir Putin. If past is prologue, he's trying to use negotiations to curry some favor with the United States, make it appear falsely that Russia's interested in a diplomatic solution to this war, when in fact Russia continues to rain down hell on Ukraine. Just last night, a massive drone and missile barrage in a residential area in Ukraine. The timing is important. We've got sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil being implemented in about 3 days, and then the Senate has their secondary sanctions bill warmed up in the bullpen. The president said he's going to sign it. So that may also be something that Vladimir Putin is thinking about when he wants to try to run this KGB false operation, disinformation operation against us, to make us think that he might be interested in negotiations.
I mean, first of all, what are you talking about? A false flag operation by the Russians? This is an American peace plan. As I put it on that headline at the very beginning here, it was formed by Secretary of State Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. So it's not a Russian misinformation. But I mean, he's still just basically, he probably could just be singing the same tune, second verse, with Kaya Kallas. How can we make sense of this?
Well, the problem is that, of course, first of all, the Europeans don't want to negotiate with Russia. That's the first point. They don't want it. And the position of the Russians is very clear. And in fact, as I had said before, I mentioned the two conditions that Putin defined in June last year. These are conditions to start the process of negotiating, meaning that the Russians are not against negotiation, but they have set conditions to start the process. And those two conditions I said is the withdrawal from the four oblasts and the abandon of the NATO membership. These are the two conditions. And since the Europeans make every effort to prevent Zelensky to comply with those two conditions, well, we have no negotiation. The problem is that Putin can afford this because he's winning on the battlefield. Therefore, he said, well, I set the conditions. You know them. I'm winning on the battlefield. If you don't comply with my conditions, I continue to move ahead. And that means that the longer you wait, the smaller Ukraine will become. And that's exactly the situation where we are. The problem is that, again, the Europeans don't want any negotiation. Remember when we had the first attempt from the Trump administration to have this contact in Istanbul in February, March 2020 this year, 2025. The Europeans made every effort to say Zelensky that he should not go into any negotiation with Russia, that any negotiation between the US and Russia would not be accepted by Europe, and therefore there would be no process. Basically, they were against any process, and we are back to what I said before, that the European Union made virtually no effort whatsoever to engage into some kind of political solution for the conflict. And that's the reason why the Trump administration don't even consider having the Europeans around the table, because they are not a party. They have never acted as a party to the conflict. I mean, they provided weapons to Ukraine, but in terms of negotiation and diplomacy, they are not a party to the negotiation.
Well, and really to your point there, I actually got on a text here just before we came on the air with Larry Johnson, a former CIA officer who's on our show every week, and he happens to be in Moscow right now on a prearranged trip already. And I asked him when all this stuff started breaking, what was going on in Russia, what they're saying. And he said he spoke to Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Russia yesterday, and asked about this plan. And she said, we haven't seen anything in writing. We're at least willing to look. We're going to consider it, but our core issues and core requirements remain the same. He spoke to General Aludinov this morning, which is the guy that was responsible for driving the Ukrainians out of Kursk area earlier this year. And he said, listen, it's a non-starter to ask us to give away Zaporizhia and the Kherson area. We're going to take it all, he said. And the Russians say that if giving up that part of that territory is part of the deal, it's a non-starter, but we are encouraged by at least some of our core issues are being addressed. But they said that unless it's all of it, we'll simply keep driving militarily until we take it all. I mean, well, yes, why they can't do that.
The problem is that we don't know all the details of the plan, because as far as I understood, it's not about giving back Kherson and Zaporozhye. It's just setting the limit to the battle line. I mean the front line. So it's not about giving back those two oblasts to Ukraine. It's just that instead of having the two oblasts according to their political borders, the idea is to take the front line as a border. It's in essence, as I said before, it's a compromise between what Putin asked and the Kyiv plan. Kyiv plan was to make the delineation on the front line. And so for the Donbass, okay, they have the political borders are considered, but for the two southern oblasts, then that would be the front line. So again, I don't know exactly whether those people in Russia, when Johnson asked if they knew all the details of that. Me neither. I don't know. I'm not sure about the details. That's that's the information I have. Meaning that, I mean, they're coming from Russian sources, so I assume they are correct. But again, there are still some doubt on it. In any case, the idea of having the two southern oblasts delineated by the front line and not the political border, this is something that apparently had been discussed in Anchorage between Vladimir Putin and Trump, and that's the compromise Putin was ready to consider and to engage into a negotiation. That's the level of information I have. Again, I'm not saying that I know everything, and maybe the information I have is wrong, but it would make some sense to find kind of a compromise between the two.
But let me ask you the question, though, from the Russian perspective. I mean, I can see an argument that why should they compromise on anything? If they say they want these lines, and they said, according to June 14, 2024 lines that Putin designated, it was all of the administrative borders, so to include Kherson and Zaporizhia. So why should they compromise on anything when they have the power to continue to compel it? Well, this is the Russian position. It's hard for me to argue against it.
No, absolutely. No, you're correct. Now, you have also to consider that in Russia itself, people start to be tired about the conflict. And that's a reality. If you look at the polls made by the Levada Center, you see that there is kind of a fatigue in the population about this. And that might be an aspect that is considered by Vladimir Putin. I don't know. And basically, you're right. Since they are winning, there is no real incentive for the Russians to make any concession to the Ukrainians. On the other hand, the idea that the fighting would continue without any prospect of ending soon might be also something that the Russian may say, okay, of course, we are winning, but on the other hand, we don't want to fight indefinitely. If we can find a compromise that helps the Ukrainian to make a decision to stop fighting, we are ready to do that. Again,
let me ask you. I'm sorry. Let me ask you one more thing here. In the amount of time we have left here, one thing not included in the 28-point peace plan, at least what's been reported, and like you, we haven't seen the actual 28 points. We've only seen them characterized. But one thing that's not even mentioned in there is something that the Russians had listed back in June 2024 is a core requirement, and that is the denazification of the Ukraine side. Do you see Russia having a compromise to not include a denazification in any kind of a post-settlement?
Well, we have to understand what denazification means. Essentially, what Vladimir Putin meant at that time, I mean, in February 2022, was in fact the destruction of all those paramilitary forces that are considered as neo-Nazi by the Russians. And these were the paramilitary forces that were used by the Kyiv government to repress the demonstrations and those people who demonstrated against, when they demonstrated to keep their rights, especially the language issue. And therefore, since the army was not ready to fight or, to repress those demonstrations, the Kyiv government established those ultra-nationalist, you can find the expression you want. They established those units, paramilitary units, to fight against the so-called separatists, and they did that extremely brutally. There were people coming from the western part of Ukraine. I mean, these guys are extremely nationalist. They are part of the. If you look at the map of Ukraine, you would see that you have the Russian-speaking part, I would say, on the east and south. You have the Ukrainian-speaking part in the center, in the west, but the center of the south and east are Orthodox, of the Orthodox religion. If you go to the far west part, where you have those ultranationalists, people coming from the Austro-Hungarian Empire after World War I, those are Catholics. They don't have a lot of common. They feel Ukrainians, but they tend to despise the Slavs. Let's put it that way. And that's for that reason those paramilitaries were recruited in that region, and those did. I mean, they created the Azov Battalion, Pravi Sector, the OUN battalions, and all that, which all originate from the western part. Even during World War II, these are movements that were created during World War II as independentist movement. They, from time to time, cooperated with the Germans, sometimes not, sometimes yes. So it was a very complex history. That's what I explained in my book, Covert Wars in Ukraine, by the way. But basically, they were fundamentally against the Slavs and the Soviets. And for that reason, these were the guys who made the Maidan Revolution, in essence. And that's also something that I explain in my book. And these are the guys who made all the brutalities, including torture and all that, between 2014 and 2022. So denazification refers to the destruction of those units. And formally, I could say, I mean, there's still this idea of denazification. But when you had the negotiation process in Istanbul in March 2022. At the end of March 2022, the Russian military high command said that the objective of denazification had been reached. Of course, that was probably in order to facilitate the dialogue in Istanbul at that time. It was probably not that it had been the problem had been completely solved, but that was the time when the Azov brigade was surrounded in Mariupol. You may remember this. Right. And that was considered as a major success against, I mean, in the framework of this denazification. And for that reason, on the 28th of March 2022, the High Command said, we reached the objective of denazification. That was reported by the Financial Times, if I'm not wrong, at that time. Now, of course, they came back with this accusation. This is something that comes back because obviously they are first of all the Azov that used to be a brigade. Now you have two corps, army corps.
Yes, it's actually expanded.
Exactly, it has expanded. Therefore, they can revive this objective. But this is the idea. I mean, denazification doesn't refer to what's happening in Kyiv itself. It refers to the destruction of those fanatical units that in fact make the bulk of the forces today. Because if you look at where those corps are disseminated, in fact, they are part of these. They have the same function as the Waffen-SS had with the Germans in World War II. Kind of a firefighter.
They even wear some of the same patches, if we can be honest.
Sorry?
They even have some of the same patches on their uniform.
Exactly, yes, in addition to that. But it's the same kind of use. That means that they use that as a kind of a reserve. That means if something burns, if things go bad in an area, they send those fanatics who are ready to fight up to the last drop. they are. It's exactly the same example. I mean, you may remember in Cherkasy, which is in Ukraine, where the Germans send even the French Brigade Charlemagne to open the cauldron of Cherkasy in 1943. If I'm not wrong, and these were SS. French SS. So, and today you have a very similar pattern in the use of those units as kind of firefighting, if you want. If something burns at one point, they send immediately those guys to solve the problem. So, meaning that the idea of denazification is probably still alive.
It is, yeah, and I'm sure for the Russians it is, and that'll be a sticking point. But one of the reasons why I think probably we aren't going to get this peace plan involved, and Russia will probably continue on militarily until they take what they want on the battlefield. That's just what I see as the most likely outcome at this point.